We mentioned in another video that there are two kinds of evidence that we can look at when we're trying to find out about the historicity of an event like the resurrection. We can look at external evidence, things like, did other writers mention any of the events that the biblical writers mentioned? And we looked at Josephus and Suetonius, and we can look at expert testimony as well, people who are more experienced in weighing evidence, and we can hear their testimony. And so that was our discussion of external evidence. Now let's look at some internal evidence. That means, does Scripture agree with itself? Is there evidence within the text itself that would give credence to the idea of the historical resurrection? And so here we mention Paul's challenge. Remember from 1 Corinthians 15, Paul had said, if the resurrection did not happen, we are of all men most miserable. So this puts the lie to the possibility of a conspiracy. Why would you uphold a conspiracy, uphold a lie that made you worse off than you would have been if you never attempted the conspiracy? So if the resurrection did not happen, Paul said, we are of all men most miserable. If the resurrection did happen, then there is no privatized faith. It doesn't, some would say that believing the resurrection or not believing the resurrection is your personal choice based on your background, your feelings of the moment, your emotions as to where you want to stand, and it's totally up to you. That's a privatized faith. But if a resurrection actually in time and space took place, and Christ is who he said he was, then it doesn't matter what your feelings or emotions or personal bent might be. You're going to have to deal objectively with the resurrection. That was Paul's challenge. So let's look at some of the internal evidence in Scripture. So we have John's witness. We have the story of the resurrection from the testimony of Mary. And we get these interesting little details about the spices that were brought. We get the detail about John outrunning Peter to the tomb and then standing there where Peter would run straight inside. If you were manufacturing a story, the fact that you would include these kinds of interesting little details lends more credence to a real event than coming up with those details when you're creating out of nothing the fabric of a lie or a conspiracy. So John includes interesting details about spices, about racing Peter to the tomb. When they get to the tomb, John includes the detail about the placing of the face cloth, the wrapping that Jesus was put in, what condition it was in when they got there. The face cloth was folded and set to one side. The wrapping was left behind and the body was gone. And then we have, and this is interesting and important, when John gives a testimony, there is historical evidence, but without the understanding of the full significance of the event. That will come later from Jesus' lips. Paul will continue to unfold some of the meaning of the resurrection. So John writes of the resurrection without sometimes in his mind at the time knowing the full significance of the event. That was John's witness. Then we have Luke's research. Luke sits down and writes his own carefully documented story that will help a man, Theophilus, to know the events that man has come to trust in. So Luke's doing careful research, and he's a doctor. He has education, and he wants to write, and he says, I'm going to write a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. So he writes with a discussion of eyewitnesses and what first-generation ministers, apostles, disciples have delivered to Luke. He is the second generation, but he's hearing it from Paul, from Peter, from others, and so they are eyewitnesses' accounts in which he's just trying to put them together in an orderly way for the purpose that Theophilus might have certainty concerning the things that he has been taught. So Theophilus has come to be a follower of Christ, and Luke is trying to provide this account to put together in an orderly way the events of the life of Christ as they have been told by eyewitnesses and disciples and other first-generation people. All right, then we have the second book of Luke, which is the book of Acts, which is also to Theophilus to explain post-resurrection events in the beginning of the early church. And in the beginning of Acts, it says that when Christ presented himself alive after the resurrection, he presented himself alive to the apostles by many convincing proofs. And the word is something in Greek akin to demonstrable evidence. So Luke is providing, again, in both Luke and Acts, he is telling us stories that have been circulating, been accumulated by eyewitnesses, by first-generation people, and he's telling us the story of the gospel and then the setting out of the early church. You see, he intends to be telling us historical truth, and it is for the defense of the gospel and the encouragement and the conviction of Theophilus. So that's what we have from Luke, dovetailing with what we know John said. And then we have the story of Matthew. Matthew includes the sections that talk about the guards at the tomb. That Pilate set a guard at the request of the chief priests and Pharisees for the express purpose of avoiding a resurrection story. So there was a guard, there was a seal, a number of guards, and a seal on the tomb that protected that tomb in a Roman way from any sort of conspiracy story about a resurrection. So it's interesting, when there is a resurrection, Matthew records the story that the chief priest paid a sufficient sum, whatever that is, to the guards for their silence. And there was a story that they came together to try to tell, that the disciples stole the body while we were asleep. And so with the money and with the story, the guards were freed, and they were offered protection from questions by the governor. What this means is nothing happened of consequence to Roman guards who were set to guard a thing. Now keep in mind the story of the Philippian jailer. What happens if the thing you're guarding escapes, right? Philippian jailer knows full well, and he's got his sword there ready to take his own life. And these guards, who failed in their duty to protect the tomb against resurrection, survived and were not given the consequences that were usual for a soldier who failed in his duty. Do you see? Evidence for a historical story of a resurrection. Again, dovetailing with what we have in Luke and John. Notice they are not telling the same story in the same words. These are three independent stories concerning the life of Christ, and in particular, his resurrection. So if we were to summarize, we have a large number of witnesses. If you look at Matthew, and you look at Luke, and you look at John, you look at the stories of Paul, there's a large number of witnesses who are still alive who can attest to the events that are being described. These stories become available in the lifetimes of many of those people. There is authentic detail in the stories of the Gospels that rings true to a historical mind, and there is astounding agreement, not copying each other, but each independently writing stories that become, that follow an essential agreement, even astounding agreement, with the stories that other biblical writers are including. And then, of course, we have the question of the disciples' faithfulness. If Jesus really wasn't, if the resurrection wasn't a reality, Would the disciples have stuck to the story on threat of death through the whole course of their lives, all 11 of them, plus Paul, right? So there is internal agreement of the historical documents. So we have internal agreement and we have external agreement. What do you think? How's the testimony stacking up for the resurrection of Christ?